access it at a later date. So you should see at the top there that it's informing us that the recording has now started. So we will progress. So we're here for the revised EYFS information session for childminders, and we have 3 main objectives which we hope to go through in the next hour. So our objectives are to outline the changes to the early years foundation stage and why these have been made. And we're also going to discuss the early years curriculum, and we're going to reflect on the new development matters guidance. One thing that we're saying, and when we're going on our training ready to deliver this, is that a lot of good early years practice, or all the good early years practice that you're already doing, won't change. So yes, the framework and different bits of paperwork and so on have changed, and we're coming sort of to grips with what those new things say, but the basis of good early years quality practice is still there. So it's about really celebrating what you're already doing really well, and then using it as a real opportunity to think about your child development knowledge, how you work with parents, and really use it as a year of reflective practice that you can sort of take your practice even further. So it's building on those good things that we already know about how important the early years foundation stage is, and how all those building blocks in our foundation years really set children up for the rest of their life. So hopefully you can see the next slide. So the revised EYFS, the main aims of the reforms, there are 2 overarching aims really. The first one is all about improving outcomes for all children. So with this in mind, there's been a real refocus on communication skills as a real indicator of life chances. And I've got some facts and figures here, which I'll just share with you that put that really into context. So this first quote is taken from Unlocking Talent, Fulfilling Potential by the DFE in 2017. And it says, by the age of 3, more disadvantaged children are on average already almost a year and a half behind their more affluent peers in their early language development. So we already know that there's a gap between those children from disadvantaged backgrounds and those who are from more affluent backgrounds. Word gap research has shown that by the age of 3, there is a 30 million word gap between children from the most affluent backgrounds and those from the least affluent backgrounds. And that's huge, isn't it? 30 million words. That's really substantial in a very short time for that young child. 1 in 4 children who struggle with language at the age of 5 do not reach the expected standard in English at the end of primary school. So again, that's a really staggering figure. And children with vocabulary difficulties at age 5 are 3 times more likely to have mental health problems in their adulthood and twice as likely to be unemployed when they reach adulthood. So it really does show their life chances, that early start, that early language, building up all that vocabulary. And I also have here, just to end that 60% of young offenders have low language skills. We have sought some views from the early adopter schools, because some schools were part of the sort of pilot, if you like, and became early adopters of the new EYFS. And they said that the revised EYFS really helped them to focus their staff's knowledge on vocabulary and that communication and language development. So really coming back to that vocabulary development and that early communication and language. So that's definitely a way forward when you're looking at the revised EYFS. On top of that, there's also the aim about reducing teacher and practitioner workload. You're probably cheering at that one. So it's about eliminating that really unnecessary paperwork and that evidence collection, and that actually we know that the best thing for our children is to be interacting with them and spending time with them. So going away and doing lots of paperwork that doesn't really involve them or that doesn't mean a lot isn't necessarily time well spent. So the EYFS is going to help us with that, and Mel later on will be talking about assessment with you. So it's about freeing up as much time as possible for us as early years practitioners, you as childminders, to be interacting with the children that you work with. So on the next slide, you'll see a reference to what we call the 7 features of effective practice. And you'll find these in Development Matters. So those of you who've printed it off, it will look, well, you can't really see it on my screen, but lots and lots of white and black pages. Development Matters, September 2020, from page 5 to 8, or you will alternatively find it in Working with the Revised EYFS Principles into Practice by Julian Grenier. And if you've been on any of the podcasts on foundation years or been sort of researching a little bit yourself, you'll have heard a lot about Julian Grenier because he was very involved in Development Matters. He has come up with these 7 features of effective practice, which, as I said, are referenced in Development Matters. We haven't got time to go through them all today, but what I do suggest, and I think Mel will talk about it at the end, is that when you have finished this training, not tonight because you will all need to get some sleep, but further down the line, you come back to those 7 features of effective practice and really think about how you see those in your own practice, what things you're doing really well and what you might want to develop. So I'll just read out the list just because it's in front of us here. So we have the first key feature, the best for every child. The second one, high quality care. We have the curriculum, what we want children to learn. Pedagogy, helping children to learn. Assessment, checking what children really know and have learnt already. Self-regulation and executive function. And then we also have the 7th one of partnership with parents. So like I said, I strongly recommend that you go and have a look at those. The 2 documents which I just tried to show you, but they're not showing up on the screen, that you really need to have to hand, either printed off or downloaded on a computer, however you work best, is firstly the statutory framework for the early years foundation stage. And this one was published just in March this year and is effective from the 1st of September. So that's the first one you need. So that will set out, as the statutory framework currently does, what you must do in respect of learning and development, assessment, safeguarding and welfare, and also development matters. And then in combination with that, you have your non-statutory curriculum guidance development matters, and that was published last September, in September 2020. So do make sure you've got the most up-to-date copies. It's sometimes easy to go and find one that's void now, that's been replaced. So do print those off or have them to hand ready. So it's always nice when things change to not go straight to looking at the differences, but to really think about the things that are already similar for us, those familiar things. So when we're looking at the revised EYFS, there are quite a number of similarities. So the first one is that those 4 guiding principles that we've had for years and years and years have remained the same. So the unique child, the positive relationships, the enabling environments, and the learning and development. And I won't read those out to you because you're probably very familiar with them. But those, always good to come back to those. Those are the principles that are guiding us in that good early years practice. And then children learning through play still remains the same. And I'm just going to quote you. I'm not going to read the whole quote out to you, but page 16, 1.14 of the statutory framework, where the EYFS talks about play as being really essential for children's development. And we know that, don't we? The importance of that play, and that remains the same. The characteristics of effective learning and how children learn also remain the same. And the headings for the learning and development also remain the same. So we still have 7, and they're still broken down into 3 prime areas and 4 specific areas. And in terms of assessment, we still have the 2-year-old progress check, and we also have the early years foundation stage profile, which, if that's a new term for anybody here, That is generally completed in the year that the child finishes reception year, often in school, but there are occasions sometimes where a child might remain with you to complete their early learning goals in an early years setting. And underneath all that, as I said at the beginning, good child development knowledge runs all the way through that. That remains the same. That's the basis of our assessments, of us knowing what to provide for the children that we're working with. And then we have a number of differences. One of those is a rewording of the Safeguarding and Welfare section 3. So the most significant change within that section, and we will come back to this in a minute, is the addition of the requirement to the promotion of oral health. So that's something to take note of. Then you'll see there's a gap underneath that, because then the rest of the differences that we're going to run through are all around learning and development. And that's the bulk of the changes that have been made within this revised EYFS. So you'll notice that the revised educational programmes really focus, as I said before, on that vocabulary and language development based on that word gap and trying to narrow the gap between those disadvantaged and affluent children. There has been a real update on development matters guidance. There's much broader age bands. So if you think about the development matters that you're working from at the moment, you've got your 0 to 11, 8 to 20, and so on. Within the new development matters, it splits it down into 0 to 3, 3 to 4, and then reception age. They're much, much broader. And that's really recognizing that children don't learn always in that linear way. And that we know that they learn at different rates and in different ways. And with that development matters, it's really intended very differently to before. It's about moving away from using it as a tick list for generating data. That's what we don't want. We want it to be used as a tool that's going to inform you of the curriculum. So what you're actually teaching and working with the children on. And Suzanne's going to cover a little bit about that curriculum a bit later. So there are checkpoints, but there aren't checklists, if that makes sense. So the focus is really on what children need rather than ticking things off, which can take a long time and doesn't always show you what you need to know. So a real focus on that broad, language-rich curriculum, that really strong focus on vocabulary, that communication and language across all areas of learning. So it's drawing on all your CPD that you've already done around vocabulary development and early language and communication. And then we also have the revised early learning goals, which I'm going to cover very quickly just at the end of my part. So we'll come back to those later. But those are the early learning goals that we expect most children to achieve at the end of the reception year. And that early learning goal can be measured as a good level of development. So for those children who achieve that early learning goal across literacy, numeracy, and the 3 primary areas are said to be having a good level or achieving a good level of development. But what we don't want to do is to teach towards those early learning goals. If we're giving children a really broad curriculum, it's going to be much broader than just teaching towards those early learning goals. And we need to remember that that measure at the end of reception year shouldn't be used as an accountability measure, but it's a tool to support transition for children going into year 1. So what do they know, what they're interested in, what do they need to work on next? And that should be shared with parents. There's also a removal of statutory local authority moderation. So previously, up until the year before last, myself, Mel and Suzanne would have been very involved in moderating across the local authority, and would sample schools and look at judgments so that we had consistency across the city. The local authority role in that has changed. So schools will still submit their EYFSP data, but we won't be involved in the moderation of that. And there's also a removal of the exceeding outcome for the EYFS profile. So before, teachers would judge a child as emerging, as expected, if they were just where they should be, and some children would be judged as exceeding. And that exceeding statement has now been taken away. And then we also have the introduction of a reception baseline assessment coming in the autumn term. So you'll hear that being referred to as an RBA, and that is statutory. There is more information on that in the statutory guidance in Annex B, and it will be done at points when children join that reception year. So changes to the safeguarding and welfare. As I've said, there haven't been huge changes within the welfare and safeguarding requirements. It's been mostly within the learning and development. The principal change really in the welfare and safeguarding is around promoting that good oral health. And I'm sure there'll be more and more initiatives and things to look at that sort of help you with ideas for that. There are some small changes as well in terms of links to updated guidance, as you can see there on the slide. So approved qualifications, there's been changes to that. Food preparation, e-cigarettes, reducing the risk of sudden infant death syndrome, and sharing information when there are safeguarding concerns, and also cyber security. So do take some time to go and look at that statutory framework and just have a look at those changes that have come about. At the bottom of that page, as I said, you will be able to get the recording of this. So if you can't quite scribble down that whole link, that is the link that you would use to find a sort of summary of those changes that have taken place. It's always nice to see it as a summary, isn't it? Rather than have to sort of read reams and reams. So that's a good sort of quick point, but I would suggest reading the whole document too. So in terms of the early learning goals, I'm not going to spend too long going into them because this is for the end of reception, but it's nice for you in those early years to know, you know, that measure at the end of reception year. So in terms of prime, there's been some little tweaks really. So in terms of communication and language, you can see in that middle part of the chart where we are now, we have three aspects. We have listening and attention, understanding and speaking. And from September, that listening and attention and understanding is being brought all in together. So we'll have two early learning goals, the listening, attention and understanding, and the speaking, and both of which need to be assessed in English. And then we have physical development. Oh, if I go to the second one, personal, social and emotional development. So we had three aspects there. And this has been tweaked slightly, and we actually have a new title now called Self-Regulation, which you'll see a lot of podcasts and bits and bobs and people talking about that. So do go away and have a look at that. And it's also part of the 7 effective practice messages that we talked about at the beginning. So making relationships, self-confidence and self-awareness have become managing self and building relationships, and that self-regulation. And in terms of physical development, we had moving and handling and health and self-care. That health and self-care bit has moved up into the PSED, the personal, social and emotional development. And physical development is now really focusing on the separate gross motor skills and fine motor skills. And then when we think about those specifics, for literacy, we currently have reading and writing. We still maintain the writing for September, but the reading has been split down into 2 different parts. So into that comprehension, so that's understanding what you're reading, and the word reading, actually reading the words. So that makes really good sense, doesn't it? Those 2 parts of reading, and we need children to be good at both of those. And then within mathematics, you'll see that there is no longer an early learning goal for shape, space and measure. And this has caused people lots of discussion, but what that doesn't mean is that we're not teaching it. It's still within our educational programs. We're still teaching it. It's just not assessed as an early learning goal at the end of reception. And then you'll notice that we have number and numerical patterns. So the emphasis now is really thinking about the composition of number and the patterns of number, and really supporting children to get really strongly knowledgeable about those numbers to 10 now. So whereas before we were looking at numbers to 20, now there's a real focus on mastery of those numbers to 10. So really knowing how those numbers to 10 are made up and subitizing so that they can see those numbers really quickly. They can recognize the dots on a dice and know that that means 3 and so on. So that's been a really positive one, actually, in terms of the early adopter schools. They fed back that they feel children have really got that depth of number up to 10 rather than whisking on to those numbers up to 20. And then in understanding the world, those have been tweaked slightly. We have the removal of technology because we were finding that so many children are brought up with that now that they're in a very different world to we were sort of 10 years ago. And those two other early learning goals have been split into three. So past and present, people, culture and communities in the natural world. And then just to finish off, we have expressive arts and design. And this has just been changed slightly. So whereas we had exploring and using media and materials, we now have creating with materials. So little tweaks within there. So I'm going to hand you over to Suzanne next, who's going to talk to you a bit more about the curriculum.
So what do we mean by curriculum? The curriculum is the what. What is it that you want children to learn? You see on the slide the Ofsted definition of curriculum, the framework for setting out the aims of a programme of education, including the knowledge and skills being gained at each stage. It's the what. It's the knowledge and skills that you want children to know in order to be able to do something. And it's also describes the knowledge and skills needed at each stage of development. What is the learning and skills that you want children to develop during their time with you? The curriculum should enable children to gain skills and deep level knowledge in their long-term memory so that children are then secure and confident in what they know. So in the statutory framework and in development matters, you'll find the revised educational programmes. These are a statutory requirement and set out a framework for you to build on based on what you know about your children, what their experiences are, their interests, where they need to go next, and you will be turning those programmes into something you can deliver that's relevant and meaningful to the children in your setting. So the curriculum must involve activities and experience for children as set out in those programmes of learning and to each programmes of learning under each of the areas of learning. The expectations for children's development must ensure that cognitive development proceeds hand in hand with their social development. Development Matters is a really good tool to help you here, but it is non-statutory and it does give you examples of how you can implement the educational programmes at the different ages. Thank you, Jenny. So what we want children to learn is that top level plan of everything you want children to learn. Language development is the golden thread across all areas of learning. It's about being ambitious for children, but carefully sequencing to help children build their learning over time. And using Development Matters, as I said, can help you with that. It's knowing what children's interests are, so that your plans need to be flexible and responding to what will actually motivate children in your care. And remember that we know that babies and young children don't develop in a fixed way. It's a spider's web with many strands. It's not a straight line. And one fascination may result in a child developing knowledge and skills across a number of different areas. That depth in learning is much important than covering things in a superficial way. We need to think, well, it's not just about learning nursery rhymes. What do we mean by that? Singing some nursery rhymes independently from memory, not just joining in with the odd words and phrases. And how do you build towards that through the time they're with you? But so that children by the age of 3 are able to singing along as they wash their hands. What other skills and knowledge and understanding does the child need to have in order to do that? Is there a clear direction towards the overall aim? And what do you know about what children can already know and can do, and what they need to learn next? So it's that curriculum. They describe the curriculum as a progression model. It sets out the step-by-step journey from where children are when they start with you to where most children should be when they leave with you, with the confidence, knowledge and skills to start either maybe at a nursery at age 3 or maybe at school at age 4 or 5. It's that unique, remember that unique child though, every child will be in different steps of that journey, and some will not be where you expect them to be and some will be beyond. You take for example wanting to ride a bike. So that might be your stated aim in your curriculum, that you want everybody to be able to ride a bike before they leave with you. You don't just put out the two-wheeler bikes straight away. You're going to support children and break down actually what are the skills that children need before they're able to use a two-wheeler bike. What is it that they need? And it's not just those physical skills they're going to need. They will also need the vocabulary, handlebars, wheels, steer, need the spatial awareness. They need the confidence, resilience, literally that bounceability, fall off, you have a go, have another go. But all those characteristics of effective learning. All these are component parts of your curriculum, but you know what your aim is. It's important not to over-plan your curriculum and not overload it with lots of different things that you want children to do, because that's not going to be manageable. But it's about supporting children to progress with support, practice and time, making sure that every stage is really well embedded before you move on to the next stage. But you know, you have that thinking beforehand, like Jenny said, that health development knowledge, you know those children really, really well. So you know what the next step children need to take and how you're going to support them in each stage of their journey. You'll know which children are confident, which children need more practice, which children need more support, which children you can just stand back and let them go, and which children never choose to go on the bike. So this is a prime time. Thank you, Jenny. The next slide, please. This is a prime time to reflect on the curriculum that you have on offer. Have a look at those educational programs and reflect on how does it meet the specific needs of your children? How does your curriculum reflect the community that they come from? Does it build on children's strengths? Is vocabulary development and communication and language that golden thread? I'm going to finish with a final sort of thought. We are not expecting, and Ofsted are not expecting, a big tome of all your aims of your curriculum and all those steps written down. But are you able to talk about what it is you want children to learn? And then how you're supporting children to do that, and what is the impact? Any questions about the curriculum? No, if not, then I'm going to hand over to Mel, who's going to talk about assessment.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm hoping you can hear me. Yeah, I can see some people nodding, so that's brilliant. So I'm here to talk about assessment this evening. And the first point is that accurate assessment is really essential for high quality early years provision. That element hasn't changed. High quality assessment is really important for high quality early years provision. But we're assessing children all the time when we're working with them, aren't we? As you're playing and interacting with them, moment by moment, you're making those constant assessments. You're thinking about whether you need to stand back and let them get on with something, whether they might need a prompt to help them get on with something. So if a child's struggling to put on their coat, you might talk them through, well, what do you need to do first? You'll be making judgments about when to model, show them what to do. You'll be making judgments about whether you need to offer help, or in some cases, whether you actually need to do it for them. So that ongoing assessment is happening moment by moment with every interaction that we're having with children. We're constantly making judgments about what we need to do to support them, whether it's playing or whether it's in life skills like putting your coat on. So that kind of ongoing assessment, as you know, is called formative assessment. We're making those judgments all the time about what children need next, moment by moment. And that kind of assessment doesn't need to be recorded. So one of the main aims of the early years reforms is that we move away from excessive tracking and evidence collection to free up more time for everybody to spend interacting with children. Because as we all know, that's what makes a real difference to children, isn't it? If you've got time to interact with them, you get to know them better, and the assessments are in your head then. You know those children really well because you've had time to interact with them. So it's moving away from very excessive tracking and recording of everything a child can do. So you know your children really well. If I were to ask you to tell me what they can do, most of the time you'll be able to recall it without referring to any kind of paperwork. There will be times where you need to record things, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the move away from excessive tracking and paperwork is to give you more time to spend with the children, helping them learn and develop, and getting to know them really, really well. So that's a really positive change. So the slide shows you a comment from the new framework, which reiterates what I've just said. So it says that assessment should not entail prolonged breaks from interaction with the children, nor require excessive paperwork. So if you can hold it in your head, it doesn't need to be written down. When assessing whether an individual child is at the expected level of development, practitioners should draw on their knowledge of the child and their own expert professional judgment, and should not be required to prove this through a collection of physical evidence. So you know your children really well. You'll know whether they can feed from a cup or are still using a tippy cup. You don't need a photograph to prove that. You just know that, don't you? Thank you. Can we have the next slide, please? Before I talk about sensible assessment, I just wanted to add a little bit more about that you having time to get to know your children. So more time to get to know your children, no need to record, you know the child, you know them well enough, and you can remember most things about what they can do. And actually feedback from those early adopter schools that Jenny was talking about earlier really reinforced that. They talked about feeling liberated by not having to write as much down. So fewer written observations gave them time to spend with the children, that in turn made a big difference because the children were benefiting from those interactions. And actually, as a result of that, the teachers were noticing more because they were writing down less. So instead of holding a clipboard or being there with a camera all the time, those things were set aside. They were able to interact with the children, and they remembered what the children could do in most cases. So it goes back to the purpose of assessment, doesn't it? So the main reason for us doing assessments is to support next steps. We assess so that we know what to do next with those children. It's not about gathering evidence to prove it. So our assessment is based on us making judgments about what to do next. That's the purpose of assessment. It's not about gathering lots and lots of evidence to prove it. That said, we still do need to record some things. So let's just have a little think about, well, okay, if we're being told that we need to record less, what is it that still needs to be recorded? What kinds of things might we still want to write down? So an example of that might be when you first receive a child. So you're thinking about their starting points. You don't know the child when they first start with you, do you? So when you're having those conversations with parents about where that child is, what their likes are, what they already know and can do, you probably want to be writing that down because you don't know the child, you won't remember that. And once it's recorded, then you use that information as you do at the moment to plan for when that child first starts with you, so that you can provide what that child needs on their first day with you. But the other reason for having it written down, that starting point, is so that you can look back at the progress that they've made as well. So it's good to record the starting point so that you can measure progress, and because you don't know the child at that point. So that's one reason for recording things. Another reason would be if it's something so significant or complex that you might not remember it. So if you think, I'm not going to remember this, then you would make a note of it as well. And you might want to record those significant moments. So when a child does something for the very first time and you want to celebrate it and share it with their parents or carers, that's another time where you might make a more formal recording, a photograph or a little note to record that wow moment. Yes, so again, the early adopters, a quote from them said, I'm just reading it, we don't need to evidence everything. That was a realization. What we do now is record what we think we might not remember, or we record if the children want us to record something. So if a child came up with a picture that they're really chuffed to bits with, or can you show mummy that I've gone down the slide for the first time? That's the time where you might record it so that you can share that celebration because it's important to the child. So that's another time where you might think about formally recording. And then you'd also be thinking about keeping more detailed records for those children that are causing a little bit of concern. So you're thinking that child's not actually making progress, they're sticking here. So that might be then where you assess in a little bit more detail. So if that child isn't on track at any point, that's when you might be making some more detailed observations and doing what we call a diagnostic assessment. So really unpicking what is it that's not helping that child to move on? What is their sticking point? So that's another time where more formal recording would be helpful. But if children are accessing your provision, enjoying it and making progress, then you'll remember that and it doesn't need to be formally recorded. And Ofsted and all of the webinars that I've watched have really reinforced that message. So Phil Minns, who's an Ofsted inspector, in a couple of the webinars that I've been watching, he said that don't do anything just for Ofsted. So if you're keeping photographs and records and learning journeys just for Ofsted, don't do it because they're not interested in that. If those records make a difference to the children and help you know what to do next, that's fantastic, but don't do anything just for Ofsted. And he also said that Ofsted won't be spending lots of time focusing on data. What they're really interested in is how well practitioners such as yourself and childminders, how well you know children, how well you use your assessments, whether they're recorded or in your head, and how well you use that assessment to shape planning and provision and improve provision. So it's not having the physical data, it's what you do with the information that you have that makes a difference to children. So Phil Minns, the inspector, is the person that talked about sensible assessment, which is what the next slide's all about. So because of the reforms, it's a really good chance to stand back and reflect on things like assessment, asking yourself, well, why am I doing this? Why am I taking this picture? Why am I doing this particular checklist? And if the answer is it's because it will help me to make a difference to the child, then carry on doing it. If it's useful, if it's meaningful, if it makes a difference to the children, then carry on doing it. But if those aren't the answers, then question why am I actually doing that piece of assessment? So ask yourself, is the assessment that I'm doing useful and manageable? And will it make a difference to the children? If the answer is yes, carry on doing it. If you can't answer yes, then really reflect on what the purpose of that particular activity is. So as discussed on the previous slide, the best and most useful kind of assessment involves that active engagement with children when you're observing and interacting with them and asking those questions. Does he need more help here? Should I just stand back and let him get on with it? What support will he need to enable him to do that? That's assessment, but it doesn't need recording. It's that active engagement that you're doing all the time. So that is what we call sensible assessment. Sensible assessment is assessment that's useful and identifies what the child needs next. It supports your planning and helps you to decide what to provide. So sensible assessment's about focusing on what the children need rather than just checking them off. So a simple assessment that simply tells us whether a child can or can't do it, can he tie his shoelaces, tick, having that recorded isn't particularly helpful. So tick lists question how helpful they are. You don't need to capture everything on a tick list. So if we look at the photographs on the slide there, We've got a little girl who's probably in a reception class trying to do some writing. I don't know whether she's successful or not, but let's just imagine writing as a scenario. So let's imagine that little girl is struggling to do some writing. She's been asked to write a sentence and she's struggling to do some writing. In that moment, you'd be assessing, well, why is she finding that difficult? So assessment is about unpicking why a child might be finding something difficult. So that's where you would look back at the progression map that Suzanne was talking about. Think about what are the sticking points on that progression map. So all of the skills that lead up to writing, track back and think, well, where is it that she's sticking at? What skills are missing there? Where are the gaps? It's not just about making that little girl do some more writing, because that's going to be really demoralizing. If she's struggling with that writing, there's no point in asking her to do more of it. It's about tracking back on that progression map and trying to find out what are the sticking points. So if you think about all of the essential skills and knowledge needed in order to write a sentence, it's really complex. So first of all, you need to be able to speak in a sentence. You can't write a sentence if you can't speak in a sentence. You need to know that those funny squiggles on the page actually carry meaning. So you need to know about print. You need to know that letters represent the sounds that we speak. And you need to know that letters are what make up words. And when you put them together, it makes a word. And when you read that word, it says the same thing. It says the same word all the time. And then you need to have the physical skills. You need to have the fine motor skills. You need the hand strength. You need the coordination to hold a pencil, to form those letters. And you have to have something to write about, not to mention the perseverance and the motivation and the determination to actually engage in writing when it's such a complex skill to master. So making that little girl who's struggling do more writing isn't going to be particularly helpful to her. So it's going back and thinking about that progression map and trying to decide where are the sticking points. It could be that she needs more of the activities on the left there. Perhaps she hasn't got the grip in her she hasn't got the pincer grip. So hanging up the washing is going to help her build up those skills. Perhaps she hasn't got the coordination. So maybe a bucket and a paintbrush to help her develop the coordination and draw great big circles will be more helpful. Okay. Finally, another reason, as I said earlier, for making your assessments is to monitor progress. But it's not necessary to track lots of examples of progress. So focus on when a child's not getting on so well, when they're at risk of poor progress, and try to unpick why that is so that you can put the appropriate support in place. So for those children who aren't on track, think about what their barriers are and whether you can put in the right support to overcome those barriers. And if that doesn't work, whether maybe there's an additional need there and they need to be referred to somebody who can support them with a special educational need. So yeah, that would be an important reason for doing your assessments. The other thing to look out for are those quieter children who aren't accessing what you've got on offer. So you put a lot of time and effort into creating lovely environments for children, but there'll be some children that aren't accessing that. So that's when you might do some detailed assessment as well, when a child's either quiet or not getting stuck into what you're offering, to try and find out why. So that would be a detailed assessment as well, to unpick why. So Jenny mentioned a book at the beginning by Julian Grenier, and just going to finish this slide with a quote from him. And he says that assessment will focus on some children some of the time, but not all children all of the time, because that simply isn't manageable. You can't be assessing all of the children all of the time. So this next slide really summarises key points about assessment. So assessment's about noticing what children can do, what they know. It's not about gathering lots of data. Effective assessment requires teachers to understand child development. So here it's knowing about whether a child is on track or not. That's your judgment. Which children are on track, which children aren't on track. So that goes down to having good child development knowledge, isn't it? Knowing what does on track mean for a 2-year-old? What are the key milestones that that 2-year-old should be achieving? And development matters is one way of helping you. There are checklists in development matters that will help you decide whether a child is on track or not. And then we've got accurate assessment can highlight whether a child has a special educational need or not. But before assessing children, it's a really good idea to think about whether the assessment is useful or not. If it doesn't tell you anything new about the child, then there's no point in doing it, is there? And that final message, that assessment should not take practitioners away from the children for long periods of time, because actually it's your time with the children that makes the biggest difference. Thank you. Can we have the next slide? So some more questions for you to take away and think about. So when you're reflecting on this evening and reflecting on the changes that you might put into place for September, think about how you find out what children know and can do. What's your current practice? That will include perhaps talking to parents, your ongoing observations moment by moment, and then think about how you identify which children need extra support. So how do you know the ones where there's some barriers, they've got some sticking points? Yeah, how do you know whether they're on track or not? And if you need to make that more detailed assessment, what tools have you got available to help you do that? So an example of what might be helpful is universally speaking resources that are available online, and they give you detailed information about child development for communication and language. So that's universally speaking. That's a really good resource because it gives you ideas and strategies to support children as well. Thank you. Are there any questions about assessment or comments? You see there's a comment in the comments box. I'm just going to have a look. No, it's just Jenny saying hello.
We had a couple of people who joined partway, so I just wanted them to know that we were recording.
Okay. I appreciate that this situation is a little bit strange. So if you go away and you think, actually, I really wish that I'd asked that question, then we're always here. So you can email myself or Jenny or Suzanne with any questions that you've got. And we don't always have the answers straight away, but 3 heads are better than 1. So we'll be able to put our heads together and answer any questions that you do have. So yeah, you should have your EYFS contact details. And if not, just send an email to earlyyears@plymouth.gov. There we go, Suzanne's put it in the chat, earlyyears@plymouth.gov.uk. So if you have any questions about the curriculum or about assessment, or where to find additional resources to help with your assessment, then drop us an email and we'll be happy to help with that. Okay, if we could have the next slide then, please. Okay, so we're coming towards the end now. So this slide's for you to take away, and it has some suggestions about what you might do in preparation for September. So some of this you will already have done, no doubt, but there might be some ideas on the slide that would be your next steps. So as Jenny said at the beginning, the most important thing is to get to know those new documents. So the EYFS framework. It's no longer called the Early Adopter Framework. I didn't notice that on the slide before, but it's now actually the Early Years Foundation Stage Framework. So get to know that. That is the statutory document. That's the law. We have to abide by that. And read the new development matters as well. That's non-statutory. but it's advisable that that's one of the key documents that you refer to help you with your curriculum and with them knowing what to teach next. So get to know those two documents. And then there's lots of other background reading out there, but in particular, there's Julian Grenier's book there. At the back, it has the development matters in some easily readable tables, which are quite handy. But what he says at the beginning of that book is also really readable, and it really helped me unpick the changes because it's written in accessible language. I was able to read it in the garden while I was out in the sun, so it's a good read. The next bullet point is brief and discuss with staff. Now, some of you will have childminding assistants, or you'll have colleagues, other childminders that you talk to regularly. I know you get together in groups. So once you've had a chance to look at all of those materials, talk to other people in your position about it, and unpick your understanding together, so that you've got an idea of what the changes are ready for September. And really importantly, reflect on your existing good practice, because you won't need to change lots. What you're doing already, good early years practice, remains the same. That doesn't change. So identify what's working really well and think about the tweaks to your practice that might be necessary. So for example, Jenny talked about the changes in the early learning goals. So if you've got older children working towards those early learning goals, you'll be thinking about different headings for those. You might be reflecting on your cycle of observation, assessment and planning, and decide that you don't need to be recording as much as you've been up until now. So are you collating more evidence than actually is necessary? That's something to go away and consider. Also, I would really urge you to spend time getting to know those educational programs in detail. So there's a couple of paragraphs for each area of learning that describes what you should be teaching under each of those areas of learning. So get to know those new educational programs in detail and think about whether what you're already doing covers what those educational programs outline, and what else you might need to do to cover those educational programs. And also think about your learning environment and the resources that you've got on offer as well. So going back to those educational programs, do you have the provision, the resources to provide what those educational programs are describing? So one example of that is there's reference to in Understanding of the World, reference to books about past and present, for example. So have you got those sorts of books that talk about past and present? That's one example of a resource that the educational programs would require. And Jenny mentioned dice. So there's a real focus on subitizing in maths. So have you got things like dominoes and dice and that kind of resource that will enable you to help children with their subitizing? Okay. And then finally, that continued professional development. Think about your knowledge of child development and if there are any subjects where you're less confident in how children develop in that particular area. And if there are, then again, you can ask us for examples of good websites or references where we can direct you to child development resources that you might find helpful. So I've mentioned universally speaking. I'm going to mention it again because there's such a focus on communication and language now, bearing in mind that word gap that Jenny mentioned at the beginning. So if you haven't already discovered universally speaking, I strongly suggest that you have a look. Google universally speaking. It's a great resource.
Now we've got a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
Has the development matters been finalised, as we have not been told that it has yet?
As far as I know, that the example that is online is the final one.
And another question, can we still use emerging and secure?
That's a professional choice. There's no expectation to do that anymore. We're moving more towards whether a child is on track or not, in order to simplify that assessment. Sometimes emerging and secure, it's a difficult judgment to make, isn't it, rather than simply a yes or a no answer. So are they on track or not?
And there's another question about, will there be more info on oral health?
Yes. I've got a meeting in my diary with Peninsula Dental School to talk about what kind of support we can, what kind of resources and support we can offer moving forward. So that is in the pipeline.
It doesn't mean, Mel, does it, that you will be expected to do toothbrushing in your setting?
No, it's just about promoting the importance of toothbrushing. So having stories about children brushing their teeth, for example, and reminding children that, yeah, I've cleaned my teeth this morning. Have you done the same? So it's not about you physically doing it, especially at the moment with COVID. Yeah.
And someone's asking, will there be a new 2-year-old check template and school transition document?
That's something that we need to discuss as a team, isn't it? Do you think it would be helpful? Let's have a lot of thumbs up.
I mean, I think the transfer document as it is, you think about it, it's the first page and it's the last page, isn't it? And it's that information that we think is, essential to sort of pass on to the school or to the next setting. And the bit in the middle was that sort of assessment about the child, and as well as sort of a narrative against the character effective learning. I think a lot of people have kind of moved away and are doing their own kind of summative assessment. And it may be that we feel that it's not appropriate for us to say, this is what you have to do in terms of the information that you think is important to share with the next provider or with the school. I guess it's thinking about, you need to be thinking about what information do you think is really important to pass on in terms of a child's learning and development. And like Mel said, being really clear about whether a child you think is on track or not. What exactly is it? And I think previously we've sort of gone down this road trying to fit children into boxes, they're emerging or they're secure at 30 to 60, 40 to 60. But actually, they more about your children and what they can do. I think it's an opportunity to really sort of celebrate exactly what it is that your children can do, and also say what support you give them, and what also you think the appropriate next steps are for those children. But certainly we will have a discussion about it, and anything else I think we need to obviously consult with the sector about it, whether they think that would be useful.
There's another question, will we be getting anything to give parents to explain the changes? If we just go to the next slide. This came in hot off the press yesterday. So the Department for Education have created an online service. And on that, there are all sorts of resources and practical support to help you as early years practitioners to implement those changes. And I believe that in those resources, there's a summary. So it's have a look at those resources. That only came in yesterday, so we haven't had a chance to explore them properly yet, but they're adding to it all of the time. So what we'll do is we'll make a note of your requests. I can see lots of people have said yes to the 2-year-old check, so we can discuss that, and we can also discuss that request as well about a parent-friendly format with some changes. So we might be able to give you a link to that, or we could we could discuss drafting something as well. So all of those suggestions we'll take to a team meeting, and if there's anything else that you feel would be helpful from us, add it to the chat or email us, and we'll consider all of the suggestions and requests that you've got. Please, can you clarify, do we still need to do a summative assessment? So by law, it's a statutory requirement to carry out the 2-year check. So that's the summative assessment. That one has to be done. And at the end of foundation stage, the early years foundation stage profile is the other one that has to be done. And then it would be up for you to decide when else that might be helpful. So when else would it be good to summarise what a child can do? So a key time for that might be at points of transition, and we would be wanting a transfer document if a child would be starting school. So that summative assessment moving from early years into a school is still really important as well. But the only 2 statutory requirements are the 2 years check and the profile at the end of the year. At key points of transition, it's really helpful to have that summative as well. Okay, the chat box has gone quiet, so please do email us with any other suggestions, and we'll take on board all of the requests in the chat box as well. We're listening to what you're saying would be helpful. So keep an eye on the early years bulletin, because that will contain any new updates. And then Suzanne, you are the blob person expert, so please interject. Well, you can do if you want to. It's something that you speak about really well, so I'm going to leave it to you. Yeah.
Hi everyone. I just put this in at the end because after we've just sort of bombarded with all that sort of information, you might be feeling like the person who's sort of the little blob person who's falling down from the tree. It's all too much and overwhelming. Or you might be sort of really excited and be looking forward to the changes. You might be this person who's looking up at the tree and thinking, yep, that's great. I know what I want to do. I know how I'm going to implement these changes. Well, however you're feeling, we are in this together. You know, this is part of what we want to do, is to support you to implement the changes. So you do let us know how you want, what you want that support to look like, whether you want, you know, small groups, perhaps face to face, and we can do so safely. Do you want training on specific areas like child development? Do you want to do getting visitors to talk about things like oral health at our childminder and after school providers briefings? So do let us know how you're feeling. And it is a journey. I mean, those people who've done Bristol Standard, we're familiar with that term. It's a journey, and we're all on this together. And it's okay to feel a bit daunted by it. You might be the person who wants to rush to the top, or you might be the person who wants to just go away and consider and let it all sink in. But I hope you've found today useful. It just might be, some of you might be further on the journey than others, or you might be at the beginning of your journey, but wherever you are, that's okay. And you do make the most of all the podcasts and the information that's available online, and also, you know, keep talking to us as well. It's been lovely to see everybody.
I'm just going to finish with a quote from one of the early adopter schools as well, and that's, don't panic. You don't have to change everything all at once. Our practice has evolved throughout the year, so you don't have to have everything ready for September and changed. It's a journey throughout the year. So this next year is going to be a year of transition. So if there's anything that we can do to help you through that year of transition, get in touch with your requests. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to say good night now. Enjoy your evenings.
Night.
Good night, girls.
Night.
Nice to see you.
It's never nice to see me.
always a pleasure.
Bye bye. It was good. I enjoyed it.
Good. I'm glad it was helpful.